It's really just great to be here in partnership with Malaprops. Thank you, Stephanie, for welcoming us all to this special event, and Andrew and Thierry to join you for this conversation. I'm just so delighted, so honored. I likewise wish we were there in person, but I know that that would maybe make it not possible for you, especially Thierry, joining us all the way from Houston. But Andrew, you're actually just, in a sense, down the road. You are joining us from down Hendersonville Way, not too far outside Asheville right now, which is family land and a place that you have deep, deep roots in. And I wonder if you might start us by just sharing a bit about your lineage here in this part of the world, of the earth.
Well, first, thank you for being here, Ethan. Thank you for being a friend for so long. And thank you for all your help over the years with what we did with Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. I spent a good part of my childhood here in, we're near Edneyville, but we're just outside of Hendersonville, sort of on the cusp between Hendersonville and Asheville. And my grandmother moved here in the 70s because she met a man and fell in love. And he became my grandfather. He was the rural mail carrier out in the Apple Valley where I'm at now. And then my mother, after I went to college, my mom had this dream of opening a nursery. And so she bought a small piece of land down the road from my grandmother, and she moved up here too. And she lived here until she passed away 4 years ago. And after my mother passed away, I took over the land. And I grew up in Atlanta. I grew up as a city boy. I'd never driven a tractor or taken care of any sort of thing like this. But there was something about working the same land that my mother worked that was healing, because my father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant who left when I was very young. And I never knew him. And I was raised by my mom. It was sort of us against the world. And I guess the only way I knew how to process her loss was to get my hands dirty, to get out and dig and plow and spread mulch, pull weeds. And so I've been here. And then after the congressman passed, I moved down here just about full time. He used to make fun of me because I would come down here on weekends. I would write, and he would say, "Boy, I spent my whole life trying to get off the farm, and now you're trying to go back." And he's right. And after he passed, that's what I did. So I'm glad to be out here because it is a special, beautiful place. I tell everybody I live in the Shire because that's what it looks like. And then I get all the fresh apples I could want. Oh, yeah, it's good to be here. And that's why I love going to Malaprops too. We'd sneak into town. I remember, actually, just to tell one more story, I remember when we did the citywide reading program for March, and Malaprops hosted it. And, I came in, he gave a talk, and Clark Olson, who was with James Reeb the night he was beaten in Selma, came to the talk. And I'm sitting there holding a copy of book 3, and I'm showing the scene depicting him. And he comes up, and we read it together, and we cry. It was just so moving to me. And it just showed me how much of a connection this work, March and Run, the work of John Lewis, the work of the civil rights movement, has to this area. And I love that. I love the people. So yeah, no, that's I'm not too far. I'm just down the road.
And if I'm not incorrect, I think you said maybe you started reading comics during some of your youthful visits to this area, and that Malaprops is certainly a crown jewel for all of us in this region in terms of bookstores, but we're extraordinarily blessed in terms of both indie bookstores, which we, again, encourage everyone to support yours, but also comic book stores. And maybe this is where you first started getting into that. Is that right?
Yeah, so my grandmother, in a way, tried to occupy me. She knew I liked to read. And so she started me reading my uncle's old comic books, which is kind of absurd when you think about it, because my first X-Men comic that I ever read was in fact X-Men #1. That was my uncle's, right? And it's just I like cringe at the thought of a 9-year-old reading an original X-Men #1. But I got into it, and so my grandmother, I remember we went to the Piggly Wiggly over off Hendersonville Road in Fletcher, and my grandmother bought me my first comic book there. It was Uncanny X-Men 317 with the lenticular cover, as the Fatal Attractions series, that whole story arc that led into like Generation X and then Age of Apocalypse and all that. And I loved it, man. And that was, it sort of is a question, right? Because, you have so many comic book readers up here and so many, I think, Ethan, we were even talking about one of your children getting into Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, we love board games. This is, people forget that this area is home to, Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor called me this, so I can call all of us this. It's home to a lot of nerds. And as a congressman say, we're a little bit maladjusted to the status quo, and that's part of what I love so much about this region and being able to be outside in such a beautiful area, but also it's a community of readers, and I think that's why Malaprops is so important, because it needs an epicenter. And for the literary community up here, it's a big community. You've got Charles Frazier, you've got Nick Filardi, who does comics, you've got Hope Larson, all these other comic creators living up here too. And I don't know if I got into comics because I was up here, or if I'm coming back up here because I've been into comics, but it's these are my people.
That's awesome. Well, I want to dig deep into Run, but first, Fury, I would love to hear from you. I mean, Andrew's talking some words that I can't even connect with in terms of the iterations of the different comic threads and so forth. What brought you into doing the incredible art and illustration that you do, and now into the realm of doing graphic memoir?
I've just always drawn for as long as I could hold a crayon, so it's hard to say like when I started to fall in love with drawing. I was fortunate that when I was 15 years old, I decided I wanted to get into like some sort of visual storytelling, and that's what I do now. And I'm so grateful for that, because I know it takes a while for some people to figure out what they want to do with their life. But yeah, I think it probably started with Disney movies. I'm sure, like I was watching a ton of cartoons as a kid. I ended up majoring in animation. In high school, I started to get into like Japanese comics, so manga. I was that kid sitting on the floor of the manga aisle in Barnes and Noble, just like flipping through. I just really, I love storytelling. I want to say I did try my hand at prose for a while, but I just found I was a stronger communicator through visuals. So I think, yeah, that was always the goal. Like Stephanie said in my intro, I started out with just a humor webcomic called Bastard Comics. That was just my intention to get my feet wet with comics in an easy way, but there was always this lure to more complex storytelling, and that lure kind of became more urgent at the end of 2016, because the world, I was not happy with how things were going in the world, and I was just it was not congruent with how I was spending my time, just like writing jokes. So I decided to transition from writing jokes to writing stories, and I was pitching one of my own comics, and that's how they discovered me. And they offered me this project, and it was kind of a dream come true, because it was I don't know, it was just such a unique way to feel like I was contributing something in the way that I could. So yeah.
That's awesome. Well, again, I'm super excited to talk about this book, which is, for me, like, it's an incredible extension of the March trilogy, as Stephanie said, and to get into some of the content about it and all that. But I think that, again, the artwork, it's really extraordinary. And one of the things that's really amazing about Run Book One is there's like this huge section of content in the back that's not even all the illustrated story. It's all this appendices and archival materials and so forth, including what is for me just a jewel, which is on page 142, I think it is, "You Are From the Artist" section, where you really dig deep into like how the process of doing this kind of historical narrative in this form, and really, having to deal with people's clothing and what was period for them and their socioeconomic status and the type of whatever cars and backdrops and so forth, even the typewriter that someone was using. So could you talk a bit about really just that whole process of really having to not just do the art that you do, but really to tie it to documents that you're reading and all this kind of piece that really relates it to historical context?
I think Andrew could probably get into like the very deep research, because when I came in, I read, I started with the script. And I remember just being astonished at how many notes were just in the margins of Andrew and all the other contributors just talking to each other and debating and saying, what's the best way we can accurately portray this? And then on my end, so they did all the heavy lifting. And then for me, there were just things that would come up like, when you get into comics, you think, oh, I get to draw all day. It's going to be fun. But then you realize, oh, I now have to be kind of an expert on Japanese architecture in the feudal era, or like in this case, I had to look into the fashion and the hairstyles, and I had to not just consider the fashion of the time. Like you can't just Google 1960s fashion because you're going to get pictures of like supermodels. You have to consider the socioeconomic status of the people that you're drawing, their age, and really just do your best to put yourself in their shoes and draw the scene around them. But I think, yeah, Andrew and the team did so much research. I can't even begin to imagine how y'all got your hands on all that. I don't know.
That was the research element of this is one of those things where we're very fortunate because we're coming along at a time where so many of these documents are digitized for the first time. And so we were able to use websites like crmvet.org, and they were a great starting point for us because the congressman would always say, you got to make it real, you got to make it plain. But one of the things that we heard so much from teachers and librarians that resonated with us was that because it was a true nonfiction graphic novel, there wasn't any sort of editorialization, or there wasn't any, ad-libbing of the dialogue or anything like that. It reached a standard which allowed it to more easily be used in the classroom. And so we really took that to heart, and we tried to do as much primary research as we could. We were using, at one point I had folks in the Library of Congress going through all the microfiche from a number of the Black newspapers. We used meeting minutes. We used after action reports. And it really was sort of like putting together this ginormous puzzle and then using John Lewis's memories and his narration to stitch it all together. But I was part of the reason we created this company that we've been working under, Good Trouble Productions, was because you need a larger team to be able to do this well and efficiently. Otherwise, it will burn you out. Nate and I both ended up in the hospital during the making of March because we pushed ourselves that hard to keep up our production schedules and to keep the taskmasters happy, and also to make sure that we got it done in a way that the readers could keep up with the story and not have to wait too long. And it's not always sustainable. And so I was really grateful. You see in the back, there's a number of people who helped me with the research. And there's a lot of congressional staff, which is cool, because we definitely bring a weird type of eye towards how we approach research. We're trained in a way to not trust anything. And so it's verify, verify, verify. And that was also really helpful. And it just, at the end of the day, this book was a giant team effort. And I felt like having a big team around us, all helping, all rowing in the same direction, that to me is my happy place. because I love to make things and I love the details. And I remember at several points stepping back and just marveling at how well the team all worked together, how healthy of a situation it was, even when we pushed ourselves beyond what we were usually comfortable with. Because it's not always like that. And I feel like that was in keeping with John Lewis's philosophy, right? That this is about working as hard as you possibly can, but also bringing a standard to your work that is the highest possible standard, but also remembering that everyone's a human being. And I'm grateful to you, Fury, because you put in the work, man. You put in the work. And I look, man, I just push keys. I when it comes down to it, that's I'm a typer. A typer and a clicker, and you bring the story to life. And so this has been the healthiest, most productive process of making a graphic novel that I've ever had.
That's amazing. Well, it's clear that all that teamwork across all the different people who play parts in it has really created an amazing product. And it's pretty extraordinary to me that the first 3 books in the March trilogy, they cover this period from John Lewis's childhood up through the period in the early to mid 60s, where he's getting engaged in activism. And then this book, it's just really 1 year. It's really this period from 1965 to 66, but so much happens in this period. And the ending of the March trilogy finishes with this landmark thing that we're talking about every day in headline news now, almost, the Voting Rights Act. I mean, it's a top of mind issue in our nation now because of the attacks on voting rights. And this begins literally, this book, Run Book 1, starts 2 days later, where John Lewis, who I think it's worth naming, just so the audience is clear, co-wrote this with you, like that, because I've already gotten that question, just because of his death a year ago. But this was written during the course of his lifetime. It's been illustrated and brought to production now. But that it starts 2 days later when he goes to Americus, Georgia. And in the course of that week, he's there and at a church, a white church that refuses to be integrated in the city that becomes known later in kind of my lifetime and our lifetimes as the headquarters of Habitat for Humanity. Right? So I think of Americus, Georgia as like Habitat and like the headquarters of Koinonia Farm, this amazing progressive multiracial community. But this is telling the story of the church, the institutional church, the white church in that place as representative, as refusing to be integrated. And then 5 days later, or maybe it's 5 days after the Voting Rights Act has passed, 3 days later is when the Watts uprising begins in Los Angeles, the rebellion. So it's just boom, like this amazing amount happening right off the bat. So I wonder if you could kind of lead us into what's happening then and how it's taking us into this story.
As we searched for a way to open this book, we spent a lot of time digging through, like I said, these old newspaper articles on microfiche. Because this moment that we open with in Americus, Georgia, 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis and some of his colleagues going to a church that more than a year after the Civil Rights Act had passed, which forbids segregation as explicitly by law as possible, meet with this organized, police-enforced refusal, and ultimately arrest John Lewis and his colleagues for trespassing and take him to jail. And on that same night in Americus, Georgia, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, a man by the name of Calvin Craig, who is an interesting figure in his own right, which you should read about. We talk about in the back. Who became the Grand Dragon, then renounced the Klan, then went back to the Klan, then renounced it again. And they lead the largest hooded march like full hoods, robes in public, the largest hooded gathering of Klansmen in public in decades from what you'd seen in South Georgia. And it was so fascinating to me to see the quotes from Calvin Craig where he's urging the Klansmen to stay nonviolent, essentially, to not hoot and holler, not call out, to be orderly, to be peaceful. And you could see in that moment, it shows rather than tells how the tools and the tactics and the strategies of the movement were being co-opted almost immediately by the Klan in their pushback against the Voting Rights Act and in their pushback against integration. And when we found that, because it's really only references one sentence in a couple different books. It's just like, oh, and there was a protest in Americus, Georgia. John Lewis got arrested. There was a Klan gathering, right? When you really drilled down, you looked at the local newspaper articles from down there and you saw the quotes and you saw how many people were there. It was eye-opening because at the time we'd already been through the Shelby County decision, which struck down a portion of the Voting Rights Act. We were starting to see voter suppression legislation be introduced in more creative ways, unfortunately, throughout the South. And this showed as clearly as possible how the dynamics of the movement were utilized by the forces trying to undermine it immediately after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And it allows you intellectually to understand that the forces we're fighting today are not new. This is a continuation of that same struggle, that same group of fighters that you see in Americus, Georgia, in their Klan hoods, carrying this fight now to today, espousing the same values, the same beliefs, the same ideas. And I remember showing those newspaper articles to the congressman and asking him, what was it like? You had just come from the White House 2 days prior. The president had just given you the pen that he used to sign, one of the pens that he used to sign the Voting Rights Act. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, it had to be done. And I think about that in terms of who John Lewis was, like how that scene illuminates so much about his character, because he would have these great moments. He would reach these mountaintops, and then the next day he would go back to work. And then that's so important to the narrative, because when Fury draws these scenes of John Lewis losing the chairmanship and suffering and feeling this pain, this deep pain at that rejection, he brings that same attitude. That attitude that I'm going to do this tomorrow and the next day, no matter what. I am so committed. I believe so deeply that my cause is just and right, that I will carry on. And I think we lose sight of all of that. This year, this 1965 to 1966, has not been studied in the same way that any other part of the movement has been studied. And yet it is so consequential to everything we're going through today. And so that is a long, long way of answering your question, Ethan. And I feel like when we were working on this book, I thought I knew everything there was to know. And every turn I was surprised. And I kept being surprised. And I continue to be surprised. Because the more you read, the more you research, the more you dig into it, the more you see that this struggle that they faced in 1965 and 1966 is the same struggle we're facing today.
Yeah, it's really deep and, as you say, so evocative for the moment that we're living in right now. I mean, I think as I read, that we experienced just 2 weeks after that, as you said, like the murder of Jonathan Myrick Daniels, and and there's the deaths of others, but like I think in reading about the death of Sammy Young, I mean, it totally brought up for me the deaths of Michael Brown and of George Floyd and others in that realm. And so there's so much for this moment that we're living in those contexts. And there's these extraordinary tensions that are coming forward. I mean, there's like 3 or 4 amazing plot lines here. One, it's powerful to hear you talk about the Klan adopting nonviolence as a strategy for kind of how they're going to do something, because these tensions around nonviolence as philosophy, as versus way of life versus strategy or tactic, are really opened up deeply here, particularly within movement circles, and we see that again within the work that Congressman Lewis, now Congressman Lewis, but then John Lewis, is doing in SNCC, and how the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is having deep, massive arguments over nonviolence as its core philosophy and process. So, and that's aligned with what's happening in the political realm, in certain capacities too, as Black-led organizing strategies are coming forward. So would you talk a little bit more about kind of that division that's emerging month by month, really, during this year within the circles that he's organizing in? Oh, you're on mute, Andrew. Sorry.
My bad. SNCC was facing an existential crisis, right? They had succeeded, but I think in many ways they felt like SCLC was taking the credit for it. John Lewis wasn't allowed to march in Selma as the chairman of SNCC because there was such a divide. And John Lewis would refuse to criticize Dr. King. To John Lewis, Dr. King was his leader. And what that illuminated really was a philosophical debate underneath it all. And it was a question about whether the philosophy that John Lewis espoused, that he learned from Jim Lawson and others, was the philosophy that nonviolence was not simply a tool or a tactic. It was a way of life. It was a way of living. And the opposite, and then the other side of the debate, which the position that many held, was that nonviolence was in fact simply a tool or a tactic, that they had faced so much brutality that the question was, how can you keep asking us to be beaten, going to prison, suffering, feeling true deep pain, and stay nonviolent? Ultimately, many of the, and these people witnessed their friends die, whether being shot to death or beaten to death. These were young people facing mortality far sooner than most of us ever do. And so I never judged the conflict. I may agree with John Lewis that nonviolence is a better way to live. But I can see and understand the pain that leads you to question whether or not that's possible. And that's what Stokely advocated for. He saw, in fact, you can read it in the endnotes. We talk about it sort of later. And you see the debate itself. Fury did this incredible job of illustrating multiple debates happening within SNCC, which is incredibly difficult to do in graphic novel form, right? Because essentially you're having a meeting, you're sitting in a room and you're arguing with each other, right? How do you bring that drama to the page and depict it? And Fury found several different tactics to bring it to life. And what you saw was this Lowndes County organization peeling off and frankly wanting to distance itself from the Democratic Party, because you can't blame him, right? Like, if they were voting in Democratic primaries, they were choosing between one segregationist or the other. And the congressman endorsed working within the party system. He endorsed using primaries to advance the agenda, to get candidates who are more friendly. He was okay with the gradual approach. And what Lowndes County was trying to say is that, no, we need our own party. We need to train people to organize and hold their own elections so that when the general elections come out, they're prepared to compete. And also to get people, Black folks particular in Lowndes County, prepared to be active voters. And that all tied into this philosophical debate about whether or not nonviolence is a way of life and a way of living. And you see this scene that Fury depicted so beautifully, where they're about to hold a protest. This is before Jonathan Daniels was murdered. And the young people, they want to march. And Stokely says you need to take everything out of your pockets that could be considered a weapon. And you see them dropping pencils and scissors and pieces of notebooks, notebook paper, and things like that on the ground. And Fury shows it so beautifully. But it's so hard to see that and not imagine every other young person of color who was shot because they had Skittles that they thought was a gun, or it was a toy gun, or some other tragic circumstance where they died because someone thought what was in their hand was a weapon when in fact it was not. And that comes back to me about this idea about how far can the human endurance stretch being nonviolent? And I don't have an answer for it. I think that's what makes John Lewis so superhuman, is that he can see this and face it every day in his struggle and remain nonviolent. As you mentioned earlier, Ethan, yes, the Congressman and I wrote all these graphic novels together. Congressman was like a father to me. And it was, I think, a great comfort to him in his last months to be seeing Fury's art. I would sneak it under the door at his house, and he would call me and he would tell me how much he loved it. Because he loved art. And seeing these stories come alive, it was his way of knowing that he was passing along these important lessons that he wouldn't be around to continue to teach. Because at this book's core, the lesson is, first you march and then you run. And you run because we need better public servants. John Lewis helped build the activist generation with March. And now, through this book, through Fury's work, he was hoping he could build a generation that would take their activism and turn it into public service. Because he believed we need better people to vote for, just like they needed in Lowndes County, as you see in the book. We shouldn't be choosing between one segregationist or the other. He was trying to call people to service so that we would have people in office, and not just in the federal government, but in your school boards and your state reps, your city councilmen, local government. If you look in Lowndes County, they were even electing the coroner. And all of these positions matter, and they need good people to run for them.
Thank you. I love the way you talked about, I mean, again, I probably misappropriately earlier on said this is like an action-packed movie nonstop, because in fact, as you say, it has these moments of extraordinary tension, these deaths and violence and conflict and so forth. And also, as you name, like the sitting in the circle for a meeting that goes till 5:30 in the morning, and your work, Fury, to bring that to life and bring these other, you wrote on Instagram something that really caught me. It said, "We know John Lewis for the big moments, but I really enjoyed illustrating the ordinary moments in between." And so that ability to, I wonder if you could talk about just how you bring that to life, and that moment of just walking out of a door or something like that, and making that a source of tension.
I'm not sure, there's little ways you can communicate emotion through body language and through framing the scene. And I think that kind of stuff I don't really plan. It's just kind of, I just do it. But I think identifying those moments that you can relate to and just kind of time traveling back to those moments. We can all relate to a moment when we're leaving work. It's our last day of work, and it's just such an emotional moment. And this whole story, there's so many ways that I am not like Congressman Lewis, but this story, ultimately, it's about like a big transition in his life and his career, and we've all had that. And you really, I think it's about looking for those similarities in your own life, and kind of those looking for those universal experiences, and putting yourself in the moment and trying to think like, what was I looking at? What was I feeling? Like, how, I don't know. It's really just about empathizing, I guess.
I think you're right. I mean, I think it's what comes through in the book is both sure, I mean, we can say John Lewis and all these other people who are in it. I mean, like there's Julian Bond, his closest friend, and there's Jim Lawson, and there's Jennifer Lawson, and there's, you know, on and on and on, Ella Baker and King and James Foreman, and people who we put on pedestals maybe in this time, and we do that. But first of all, so many of them were whatever, they were between the ages of 18 and 30 or 32 or something like that at the time, and so they were coming up with that. And we can create those pedestals, but the story tells just stories of, as you say, I think, loss and grief and transition, as you said, and we can really relate to that. Those are universal components that really connect you to the story, no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm. And then like disagreements among friends and colleagues that, you know, that it doesn't make the other person a bad person. And when you have like a close friendship or a relationship with that person, you can recognize that. And I think that was another thing that really came through in the writing, and I hope it came through with illustrations.
Awesome. I want to ask one more question from me at the moment, and then we're starting to get questions from our audience, which is fantastic. One other really amazing part of this story for me is what we might call intersectionality, but certainly the ties between what's happening here in this country around liberation movements and demanding equal rights, human rights, and the connections to struggles globally. And we see these powerful connections. And this is, again, before King in April of 1967 makes his speech at that point, which for people in justice movement work is a really important one, when he speaks at the Riverside Church and names the triple evils of racism, militarism, and materialism. This is 55, 56, and the connections that are happening to Vietnam and the war that's growing and growing and building there, to the Dominican Republic, to South Africa and John Lewis and others sitting in the embassy in New York and against apartheid at that point. Years before the anti-apartheid international solidarity movement becomes a bigger thing. So, Andrew, could you talk a little bit about those connections, kind of this Pan-Africanist for sure, and also global struggle that is being described?
SNCC's consciousness around global movements had really begun to evolve and grow after the March on Washington. They were invited to travel to Africa together, many of the leaders. It was actually paid for by Harry Belafonte. That's where John Lewis spent the most time and really got to know Malcolm X at a hotel in Nairobi, Kenya, which is always fascinating to me. This is October, November of '64. And Malcolm says to John Lewis, I think the only way our struggle will succeed is if we're able to build a international coalition of the poor, because the struggle fundamentally would run up against, would run aground when it came to sharing wealth. And you see that over and over as a theme that played out in SNCC's perception of its role in international conflicts. They were advocates for the initial sanctions against and a boycott of South Africa under the apartheid system. They realized that while they were linked as people of the same race, their coalition was fundamentally fighting for access to wealth and access to food, access to housing, access to education, access to healthcare, all of these things that were being deprived of them. It was one thing to be able to go into a restaurant, but it was another to be able to afford the hamburger. And in Run, we really get to see how those debates and philosophies collided in the face of war. Because the Vietnam War is central to everything that happens in 1966. SNCC issues their statement in January opposing the Vietnam War, which essentially cast them as a political outcast. The NAACP criticizes them. The Urban League criticizes them. All these organizations that they held together during the March on Washington were now criticizing them and leaving them out, not helping them raise money. But they did it because they believed it was the right thing to do. They did it because they felt that, as we show in John Lewis's own words, that America needed to create a peacetime economy, that our entire economy had come to be built around war, and we had been exporting that war to these other continents and these other countries and facilitating these divides, facilitating these conflicts, in many cases selling the bullets that were used in these conflicts. And he challenged the country, even in 1966, long before we had debates over the war in Afghanistan. He was asking, when are we going to take the time and do the necessary work to build a peacetime economy? And the logistics of that, the debate and the backlash, Julian Bond being refused his seat in the Georgia General Assembly for supporting SNCC's statement, the swift and painful pushback that ultimately, I think, was one of the threads that got pulled that helped unravel John Lewis's chairmanship. But they were fighting this issue, and it's so relevant to what we're going through right now as we face what did we do wrong, what did we do right in Afghanistan, and everything like that. We were spending so much money on war and we forgot to spend money on peace. We were building bombs and tanks and not schools and hospitals. And that's the fundamental question this book asks when it looks at our international involvement. And I think, again, taking out the voting rights element, taking out the police brutality and the officer-involved killings and things like that, you have this other theme. Like you talk about the mini plots of this book, and that's why you can only show 1 year in this book, because there's so much happening. You have to also look at what that wartime economy was doing to the peace movement, how it was undermining and causing fractures. And it's so important for us to understand it as we look at how we got into the Iraq War and into Afghanistan in the first place. Right? We all wanted revenge. We wanted blood on our hands. There was this jingoistic fervor, and we never stopped to ask, are we going to be able to take care of the people we're asking to go into the war zone? This isn't in the book, but one of the first jobs I ever had in Congress was as a caseworker helping veterans coming back from Iraq. And what I saw over and over was that their medical records and their service records were not being adequately maintained, so that when they came back with bullet wounds and shrapnel embedded in their body, they couldn't go to the VA and get it treated, because we went to war in such a fervor that we forgot to take care of the people we were sending. And it's that same thing. We were building bombs and bullets and not hospitals and schools. We weren't doing the necessary work to take care of our people. We didn't have a peacetime economy, which is the question John Lewis asks, and that we all need to understand if we're going to understand how America's role in struggles all across the globe came about.
I think that's a great lead in. We've gotten several questions from our audience, and I know there's clearly a number of people who are eager for even what comes after this. But so there's interest in, for each of you, what is something you really have taken from this project, this particular book project, that's informing your thinking and your work and all that. And there's clearly a desire for a teasing of what's going to be coming next in book 2. So I want to put those to both of you right now.
You want to go first?
Yeah. Just the whole experience of working on this in 2020. It was such an emotional project, but it was also such a gift because it was just a gift because you read about what's happening in the news, but there's a certain part of you that's like resisting really like reading too much into it because you don't want to get depressed or something. But this project kind of forced me to like sit in this. And, you know, like if you talking about, you mentioned Sammy Young earlier, illustrating that scene, you know, it was just, it was really powerful because it gave me hours and hours to meditate on like, this kid was 21 years old. I think he was in the Navy, right? And he had been registering people to vote earlier in the day. And just to think on like, what would his life had been like if he hadn't been murdered for trying to use the bathroom? And it was an emotional experience, you know, that for every single scene, you know, it really gave me the opportunity to meditate on this and really sit in those emotions. And it was unpleasant at times, but I can't think of any other scenario where I would have gotten that experience. So I don't know if that's a very clear answer, but just I'll never forget the year working on this.
Well, it does strike me really, as you say, that I mean, I think about the fact that the March trilogy, if I have the chronology right, were all written pre 2016, essentially. So pre the last administration. I mean, the last one or two did. I guess maybe book 3 was written in the aftermath of Michael Brown's murder. So there was that framework that was really informing some of the intersections. But in terms of this past year of extraordinary protest and movement building amidst pandemic, and working on this project in 2020 into 2021 had to be really intense, as you say, like really.
Yeah, yeah, it really was. But,
Andrew,
I mean, I wouldn't trade the experience for anything.
Yeah. Andrew, would you say something about that as well?
Yeah, you know, the thing I took away from this, which was surprisingly helpful, is I came to understand how much John Lewis had lost, how much he had suffered. I mean, I think we think of his pain as being beaten, but ultimately being successful. And we never think of him being rejected by his colleagues. We never think of him losing a position. We don't think about him in the context of having to leave his organization that he helped build because of his moral beliefs, because he thought what they were doing was wrong. And that has helped me in many ways as I've dealt with the congressman's death, to remind me that for as revered as John Lewis was at the end of his life, he had a lot of ups and downs. And what made him so special was not just his courage in the moments that everyone was watching, but his perseverance when everyone had left him. So when I get down and I miss my mom and I miss my grandmother and I miss the congressman, just think about all that he went through, not just in this period, and many of the times that I knew him as well, but in writing this book, it showed me so much about his ability to pick himself back up, to keep going, to stick to his beliefs, no matter what other people said. And then to know the long arc of this and know that he was ultimately proven right. That is what I've really taken away from this book.
We've gotten a question that takes it back to the point of the story that you've told many, many times, but some people here certainly haven't heard, it appears, about how did this whole project, and by that, I mean, certainly this book, and again, we do have the question of what are we going to get in book 2, but this whole process come to being. So, you know, I'll defer to your telling of the connection to FOR, which hopefully will emerge in that, but share a little bit with us about 2008 and how this came to being.
Well, I'll be brief. The congressman used to tease me. He used to say, "This is your chicken story, boy." I was working on the congressman's as his press secretary in his reelection campaign in 2008. And there's a lot of backstory about, the vitriol that he received and the pushback and everything for his endorsement of Senator Clinton and how they pressured him to switch and all that sort of stuff. But it really forced the question, how do you tell John Lewis's story? How do you help people understand all that he did in his life? And so in those conversations, I was also the congressman's digital director. I got him online. And so then I did the hashtag Good Trouble. And that kind of became his ubiquitous catchphrase. It was all part of this reinvention. And the other part of that was that he should write a comic book. And it all came about because it was coming down to the end of that campaign. And the congressman was sitting with us, and we were all talking about what we were going to do after. Some folks said they were going to go to the beach. Some folks said they were going to go see their parents. I said I was going to DragonCon. And everybody laughed at me, except for the congressman. And he said, don't laugh. There was a comic book during the movement, and it was deeply influential. And he was talking about Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about it. So I remember going home that night and looking it up on the internet because I was like amazed, all these stories that I had never heard in school. John Lewis, I was watching him tell on the campaign trail, and explaining to me the power that young people had and their ability to organize and ability to affect change. And so I went home and I looked it up on the internet. A guy named Ethan Persoff had posted it. There's this beautiful digital copy. And this comic, it's 16 pages, cover to cover. This is it. It's done in this studio house style from the 1950s. It introduces you to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the Montgomery bus boycotts, Gandhi, and the philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. And I remember reading it, being so impressed with how beautiful and well done it was, thinking, why isn't there a John Lewis comic book? And so I went back the next day. We had another one of these meetings, and I raised my hand and I said, I think John Lewis should write a comic book. And everybody laughed at me again. Even the congressman, he was like, I don't know. Well, maybe, And I just kept asking and I kept pushing him until finally one day he said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me. And that's where it all came from. And then at the same time, I started working on my graduate thesis at Georgetown because I don't know what was, it was one of those periods of my life. I was working full time on the Hill, writing March, and going to grad school at night. And I had so many questions about Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story that I asked if I could write my thesis on its history. And what we found was that Dr. King himself actually helped edit it. And Jim Lawson and others, in partnership with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, used it on something called a reconciliation tour, where they would go and give nonviolence workshops. And they would hand out the comic and they would use it to spread the message and give people something to take away and show to other people. And Jim Lawson himself, who helped me with my thesis, told me stories about how some of those young people in those workshops actually ended up leading some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience of the movement. Sit-ins in the Midwest that happened in 1958, long before the sit-in movement took hold in the South, led by Jim Lawson at workshops using that comic book. And so I made the case, this was something that this was a device that caused a lightning bolt moment. Well, how do we manufacture lightning? So we used Jim Lawson's path and the work of the Fellowship of Reconciliation as our guide to go to schools and libraries and institutions and essentially do what they did and give speeches, give workshops, and have the students take the comic with them on their way out and read it. And we believed, and the congressman believed before he passed, you had this generation, he called it the March generation, that they were rising up in the spring of 2020, that he had reached them, he had taught them these principles. And so that's where the comic book comes from.
Well, that is awesome. Well, I will say that for this amazing book, as you've done with each of the March series, for Run, your publisher, Abrams Books, has offered, I think, right off the website, lots of resources to use it if you're an educator or your community group facilitator, things like that, ways to have conversations around this. And we're trying to do our best a few decades later after publishing that in December #57. But this month, FOR is publishing a series of study guides for people to use, because we've, as you've named, Andrew, we distributed 250,000 of them in 50s and 60s, thanks to Jim Lawson and others. But now there's going to be a contextualizing series of study guides for middle school and high school and all age groups. So it's something we're going to be offering. People can get off of our website at forusa.org. So I want to maybe go from there for a final question for each of you to wrap up at this point. Fury, like, what an amazing way to come into the work of graphic memoir. Oh my God. Like, as you said earlier, sort of like dream come true. Hopefully you're going to be continuing to work on Run Book 2. I know you've built off the extraordinary work of Nate Powell, who did the March series, and I see his Save It for Later behind Andrew there, which is awesome. Really recommend to everyone. Are you going to be getting more into this nonfiction work? What's next for you and your work?
I think I want to start writing, or I have been writing, and I want to get into some fiction work. I had never envisioned myself working on nonfiction, honestly, but I'm definitely open to it now, because it was such a unique, challenging experience, but it was really enjoyable. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, I encourage everyone to check out your different media streams on social media and your website and all that. Really gives just such a beautiful display of the different type of work you've been doing. And congratulations on Run. You've done an amazing job with this really just important story. Andrew, what's next for you? You've got, I think you mentioned earlier, you're doing this publishing piece in terms of comic books. What can you share with us about that?
We, I've partnered with some pretty incredible people in the comics industry: Kelly Sue DeConnick, Matt Fraction, Valentine Delandro, and my longtime friend Vaughn Chanel, who helped me every step of the way with March and Run, because we believe that there's this moment in time that exists now for nonfiction graphic novels where they're needed more than ever. This is the language of this generation. And if we want to teach them the history, we want to teach them about things that they wouldn't otherwise understand, we need to use graphic novels and graphic memoirs to do that. And so we're very excited. We've worked with Ben & Jerry's. We designed an installation for their factory. We've worked with New York City Public Schools to make comics for their curriculum. And then we're going to start branching out into doing our own comics. And that kind of goes hand in hand with what I'm doing at Georgia State, because I feel like there are more people who need to be empowered to tell their own story. And Georgia State has a close connection to it was where my mother went. My grandmother never went to college, but she did work there as a secretary. And it graduates more students of color than any other university in the country. So I felt like it was important for me to pay that back and help teach other people how to do what we did. When we started this, John Lewis was the John Lewis that you know today did not exist. And there's so many other people whose stories have such importance and yet have not been given the spotlight that they deserve. And we feel like that's something that we can do uniquely well to help bring these stories to light and help offer them for schools and classrooms and curriculums. Because I think we're all searching a little bit to understand our world better. And I think that at the end of the day is what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people understand the world and understand it just a little bit better and do it in their language. So I'm doing that. And then also I wrote some Batman stuff. So, I'm kind of all over the place. And then you should see it. I got the fields there nicely mowed. I got my oil changed in the tractor. The dog is quite pleased. I'm going to try and plant something in the spring. Hopefully it'll go a little bit better than my pumpkin patch that got eaten by all the squash bugs.
Well, we are delighted to have you back in your family's homeland here and keeping that grass mowed and doing all that you're doing, Andrew. What a pleasure to speak with both of you today about this really just extraordinary book and in this amazing, amazing series. Thank you all out there in the audience today for joining us for this conversation with Andrew Aydin and Elle Fury about Run Book 1. Please pick up your copy. We encourage you to get it from Malaprop's bookstore. Thank you to Stephanie and the team at Malaprops for hosting us for this conversation about Run. And stay strong, stay healthy, and peace with everyone. I'm Ethan Vesely-Flad at the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Be well.